So, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are at the moment. Thank you for making the time to listen to the webinar. I know how busy everybody is, even during the lockdown, so I always take it as a compliment when people turn up for my webinars. I plan to talk for about 30 minutes, then take questions. You can submit questions to this chat function that some of you have found already. And I'll address those questions at the end. So today's webinar is based on my last book, Leadership in the Life Sciences. And although it's based on solid research, Leadership in the Life Sciences is, it's fair to say, my least academic book, in the sense of my publisher asked me to write one that was relatively short and could be read in a matter of a couple of hours. According to Kindle, you can read this book in 2 to 3 hours. The book began life at Linate Airport in Milan, where I was chatting to the man sitting next to me in the departure lounge, as I'm sure you're familiar with. So he asked me what I did, and I was telling them that I had just been teaching on the master's program at Bocconi University, where I teach strategy in the life sciences industry. He told me he'd worked for several companies as CEO and various different industries. And I said, that's unusual. From my perspective, that's unusual, because in my industry, pharmaceuticals, medtech, where I've worked in all my life, the leaders usually stay within that sector. And it's relatively rare for an outsider to come in and be successful in the industry from outside the industry. Now, the guy sounded a little bit skeptical at that point. He said, really? Leadership is just leadership, right? And I was about to reply when the flight was called, and he went off to priority boarding to the expensive seats, and I went and queued up for the cheap seats that you get on a university budget. But his question stayed in my head, because my instinct, my gut feel, was that leading a pharmaceutical or a medical technology company is not the same as leading a consumer goods company, or an IT company, or a service company, or any other kind of company. But I didn't know that was true. It was just my gut feel. So I decided to add it to my research agenda, because it fits very well with my wider research into the evolution of business models and the evolution of competitive strategies in our industry, which is what I spend most of my time researching. Now, research, of course, is inspired by questions. And most of my questions are inspired by Charles Darwin. Most of you will know that I'm what they call a generalized Darwinist, meaning I apply Darwinian evolutionary theory to the evolution of our industry. So the first thing I did was to begin by reading the management literature to see if anyone before me had looked at how leadership differed by industries. And as I'm sure you know, there are hundreds of thousands of books written about leadership. But almost all of them are entirely industry agnostic. In other words, they're just like the guy at the airport. They think that leadership is leadership, irrespective of industry. So finding that made me even more interested to find out what leadership was like in the life sciences industry and if it differed from other industries. So my Darwinian view of the world led me to ask then, how is the leadership environment different from that in other industries, or is it different from that in other industries? Because to me it seemed naive and simplistic to assume that leadership environments are all the same, so that the leadership environment doesn't vary between industries seems simplistic to me. And then, of course, if the leadership environments are different, then we might expect leaders to adapt to those differences. So that led to my next question. You've probably heard the phrase survival of the fittest, which was never used by Darwin, actually. It was used by Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. And when he coined the phrase survival of the fittest, that you've all heard, he didn't mean it in the sense of survival of the strongest or the cleverest. He meant it in the sense of survival of the one who fit the environment best. The biologists measure fitness in the number of offspring you leave behind, the number of kids and grandchildren you have. That doesn't seem to be a particularly useful measure of how good a leader you are, I don't think. So in this context, fitness means how much your methods and so on are copied. So in other words, that equates to fitness meaning sustained success, because it's the successful people who are copied. So I wanted to know what determined the fitness, the sustained success of leaders in the life sciences industries. My question really was, what's the single most important factor in ensuring the sustained success of a leader in the life sciences industry? So that question hadn't been asked or answered anywhere else. That, of course, would lead me on to the next question of how do life science leaders achieve that sustained success? In other words, what do they do to adapt to that particular environment in order to achieve evolutionary fitness? And then, of course, because my ultimate goal, was to uncover lessons that the led might learn from their leaders, I wanted to ask some questions about that. So these 5 questions were essentially the research agenda for my book. They're essentially the 5 questions that I asked the 23 CEOs and C-suite leaders that I interviewed for this book, although I used different words when I asked the questions. And the answers to these questions are what I'm going to cover in this webinar. But let me begin with a spoiler alert. The guy at the airport was wrong. Leadership isn't leadership. So I've already answered the first question, really, haven't I? Because the existing literature hardly says anything at all about industry-specific leadership. So let me move on to the second question, and about how the environment is different. So this was pretty much the first thing I asked the CEOs, and do you think anything is special or different or exceptional about this industry, or is leadership in your industry the same as in any other industry? And many of them were able to answer this question because although they'd worked in our industry all their life, many of them had experience in other industries, such as non-executive directors and so on. And in their answers, it turned out that there were 4 important ways that they think the leadership environment is different in pharma or medtech or other life science industries compared to other industries. 4 important differences to which they needed to adapt. First thing that he mentioned was the relationship between our industry and society. Namal Nawana of Smith & Nephew put this really nicely when he said, we touch people at the most vulnerable stage of their lives. In effect, he said, society gives us a license to exploit human illness and injury and misfortune. And in return, we promise society that we will do our best to save, extend and improve lives. Now, if you think for a moment, it's quite hard to think of another industry that has that same contract with society. So that's something that makes our industry a bit strange, unusual. The second thing that the CEOs talked about was the complexity of the industry. So we tried to create value in something like 100,000 different diseases using science that's very complex and quite often not fully understood. On top of that, we tried to manage numerous injuries and conditions that don't count as diseases. And we do all of this, and we're assessed by not one kind of customer, but by 3 kinds of customers: payers, patients, and professionals, not to mention ancillary influencers. And those customers assess the value that we deliver both clinically and economically. And because we're a global business, we do this in 180 countries with different rules, in different regulations, different cultures, different healthcare systems, different competitors. So all of those factors together mean that our industry is not just complicated, but complex in the sense of complexity science or in the sense of chaos theory. Now, other industries are complex too, but it's hard to think of one that's as complex as the life sciences industry on both its supply and demand sides. The third thing that the CEOs talk about as being unique or special about the industry was the nature of risk in the industry. See, in our industry, we invest huge amounts of capital into innovations that have a very high chance of technical failure. It's slightly different in pharma and medtech, the amounts and the nature of investment, but the basic rule holds true. And even if it succeeds technically, those products might fail commercially, not just because they don't compete well, but because of market access issues. So we have a combination of technical and commercial risk, which is unusual. And unlike most industries, those risks don't end with launch. So if you think about the classic cases of Vioxx or vaginal mesh in medical technology, you remember that risk can last for decades after launch. It's very long lasting is the risk in our industry. So that means that risk management is a very different issue compared to industries that deal with well understood science or sell to ordinary consumer or business markets. Again, it's hard to think of an industry that has the same risk profile as the life sciences industry. Excuse me. The fourth and final point of difference was the people. As Deborah Dunsire of Lundbeck said, to be a world-class life science company requires you to have a very high concentration of intellectual capital across a remarkably large range of disciplines. So think about that for a moment. As you know, the cleverest people in our industry are on the same level as the world's best academics. And we don't just have a few clever people, or clever people just concentrated in one or two departments. We require graduates and postgraduates right across the company in a huge range of disciplines, from all kinds of basic science to health economics to law to everything. And it's hard to think of other commercial organizations that have the same workforce profile as a typical pharma or medtech company. Now, importantly, I'm not saying that no other industry has any of these factors. There are other industries that are like the life sciences in some respects. So aerospace has high risk, for instance. The defense industry has a contract with society. But what makes the life sciences industry exceptional is the combination of these four factors together. They all act at once and they all interact with each other to make the exceptional environment of industry to which our leaders must adapt. In other words, although there may be many basic principles of leadership that apply across all industries, like being decisive, having people skills and intelligence and so on, leaders in the life sciences must adapt to this exceptional context that's made out of these four factors. And I think that's one of the most fundamental lessons that I learned from the research from my book. So if you, like me, accept the idea that the life sciences industry is an unusual environment in which to lead, it raises the next interesting question, doesn't it? What determines evolutionary fitness for a CEO of a life sciences company? In biology, take examples from biology, we know that evolutionary fitness for apex predators comes from the ability to kill prey. For prey species, evolutionary fitness is determined by the ability to avoid predation. For us humans, evolutionary fitness is determined by our ability to adapt to any environment, from Arctic tundra all the way to tropical rainforest. So when I asked pharma and medtech CEOs what their survival depended upon, an interesting story began to emerge. You see, in all companies, success is achieved by two things. Successful companies specialize their people to do specialized tasks, and then they coordinate across the specialisms. Now, this isn't unique to our industry, it applies to any industry. It's economics 101, and it goes all the way back to Adam Smith in 1776 when he wrote about a pin factory up in Scotland somewhere. But the interesting thing is that changes in our industry environment are creating an interesting issue for CEOs. Now, I'm sure you'll have noticed, if you work in the industry, and all of you do, I think, is that in every part of our industry, from discovery to operations to commercial, the environment is becoming more complex, both technologically and sociologically. And this is forcing our specialists, whether they're scientists or marketers or whoever, to become ever more specialised in their knowledge. For example, it used to be possible, when I joined the industry 40 years ago, to be a pharmaceutical marketer or a pharmaceutical physician or a research scientist. But now you're much more likely to describe yourself in terms of a subfield like oncology or digital or external innovation. In other words, you have become even more specialised than your predecessors. And this new increasing specialisation means that you have to develop new skills, new vocabularies, and new ways of looking at the world. This specialisation is necessary, but it works against coordination, simply because we're also focused on our areas and we have our own words and language and ways of looking at the world that we find it harder to coordinate and understand each other. So there is a there are two opposing forces. One, the need to specialise in order to match the environment, and the other, the need to integrate across functions, and the two things work against each other. It would be easy to get a room full of generalists to speak to each other. It's much harder to get a room full of specialists to speak to each other. And it's the ability to reconcile these two opposing forces that determines the evolutionary fitness of CEOs in pharma and medtech. So let me put that again to you in a slightly different way. In the language of management scientists, the big issue for CEOs is to achieve something that we call bicongruence. Bicongruence is when every individual function understands and adapts to its particular macro environment. For example, market access people adapt to the peer environment. And then the opposite of microcongruence is when every individual function understands and adapts to its internal environment. For example, the alignment of regulatory, medical, market access and marketing in commercial. And as our environment becomes more and more specialised and complex, this becomes much harder to do. This appears to be, from what I can find out in my research, what makes good CEOs and breaks the others. So I think life science leaders have realised that survival in the market, you could call it survival of the fittest, or you could call it survival of the most bicongruent. So how do they do it? How do they adapt to achieve fitness in their environment? To take biological examples again, dogs evolved to be pack animals to catch their prey. Rabbits evolved the ability to burrow to avoid being their prey. Homo sapiens like you and me evolved complex cultures to adapt to the jungles or the tundra. So what behaviours do CEOs evolve in order to adapt to this unusual environment and achieve bicongruence? Well, several traits emerged from the research. Too many to mention today. The important thing is that they were all common to all those I interviewed, and they seem to be specific to the life sciences environment. I don't have time to describe them all today, so I'm going to pick two that I find especially interesting and I think will be relevant to you. If you want to know the others, I'm very happy to talk to you offline about it, or you may even have to go buy the book. Now, the first thing that came up surprised me because I'm relatively skeptical about mission statements. In most companies, they're a meaningless decoration for the reception area or the annual report. But in every single life science company I spoke to, the leaders told me that they used the mission statement as a critically important leadership tool. Now, this was interesting to me. This wasn't what I was expecting to hear. So when I asked them why and how the mission statement was important, 5 reasons emerged. The first is the social contract. The social contract demands a mission statement that is about patient benefit and not just for private profit. So, for example, Gabriel Birchie, who's the CEO of Grunital, said that their mission statement is a signal to the world that their company is about innovation and patient benefit and not about financial engineering. So it's an adaptation to the social contract. The second thing that you mentioned was that in complex organisations full of bright, educated people, you can't micromanage them. So you have to give these clever people lots of freedom, lots of discretionary activity, as they call it in the jargon. And the mission statement provides that framework for individual discussion. In other words, it guides them without ordering them, as one of the research respondents said. The third thing that CEOs mentioned is that mission statements prevent things that cost the company its reputation. So more than one of the CEOs told me that the whole point of a mission statement is to prevent something analogous to the VW emission scandals from happening in pharma. The mission statement helps to make it obvious what would enhance and what would damage the corporate reputation. The fourth thing they mentioned is that you can't lead these armies of very bright, educated experts simply with cards and sticks. They have to commit emotionally to the company. This is what academics call affective commitment, and it's distinguished from the sort of commitment that you have for financial reasons, say. And the mission statement effectively helps our bright, educated workforce to feel like they're part of something bigger. And then finally, the fifth thing that the CEOs mentioned was that life sciences environment often involves making difficult choices under high degrees of uncertainty. You just don't have the facts or the data, the high level of uncertainty. The mission then helps to narrow down the options by asking questions like, does what we're about to do fit with the mission statement or not? So CEOs emphasize the use of the mission statement, and they see it as a leadership tool. That's one of their adaptations. And the important thing is they do this because it is an adaptation to these 4 special conditions I mentioned a moment ago: risk, complexity, expert workforce, and social contract. So that's one of the 2 I'm going to mention. The second I want to mention concerns leadership style. Now, if you go into any airport now, you'll see the shelves. Not that we go into airports at the moment, but when we go back to airports, the second the thing you'll notice in all the bookshops is that the shelves are groaning under the weight of books about leadership, and they mostly fall into 2 camps in terms of style. Okay? These 2 camps. Broadly, they talk about you should be a leader either like Steve Jobs, the visionary who understands the situation better than anybody else, anticipates the future and directs the company towards it, or the servant leader who, Nelson Mandela is the example most often quoted, who enables his team to envision and create the future. They're 2 opposing types, they're 2 very different types. So that's what the literature would have you believe is the choice you have. But as I did my research, I discovered that neither of these models were visible. Neither of these models described what I was seeing among these 23 successful leaders that I spoke to. In fact, those leaders that I spoke to seemed to think that these models were either irrelevant or not appropriate to life sciences companies. And again, it comes down to fit again. You see, the industry, if you consider being a visionary, the industry is simply too complex. Think of all the science and technology and markets, too complex for a single person to be visionary and lead the company. And even if they could, that's not often how bright, educated forces want to be led. They want to feel part of it rather than be dragged along. On the other hand, if you think about being a servant leader, then that requires to leave these bright, educated, but very specialized people to themselves in groups and then work out some kind of agreement. And that doesn't really work in our industry. It's just too complex for that. So servant model doesn't seem to be appropriate either. So of course, my question's then all about, well, how does a leader in the life sciences industry lead? And what emerged was something that I would call the decision facilitator style, or the decisive facilitator style. A decisive facilitator facilitates the contribution of experts to important decisions, but then he or she crystallizes the decision, much like you did at school when you dropped a seeding crystal into a supersaturated solution of potassium permanganate and got all the crystals to drop out. Now, this was a very strong thread that came out in all the companies interviewed, so I probed deeply into how it worked in practice. And what emerged were 5 key steps. The first step in the style of leadership is about defining the scope of the decision. And it's important because teams of these super qualified expert people don't have a shortage of ideas. They have too many ideas. And the role of the leader then is in the words of Roland Diggelman, who was of Roche and is now of SNN, is to paint the white lines on the tennis court to make clear what the decision needed to be about. The second step is the creation of the human system. This means, these are the words of Andy Thompson, approaches, and he talked about the task of creating a cultural bias for action. But the human system is more than that. It means creating a culture for a good decision, like focusing on the facts, avoiding getting personal, and when necessary, creating sub-teams to make the right decisions. But it's about creating the human systems, as Andy Thompson called it. The third step of being a facilitator is avoiding critical information gaps. The leaders I interviewed talked about surfacing the critical issues and thinking about them in abstract before getting lost in the detail. As one interviewee said, it's always the problems that you don't know about that come up and bite you. At this stage, Mine Randall Logan at B. Braun was really interesting because he talked about his job being to make sure that everybody's voice was heard. This was his way of saying that you fill the critical information gaps. So the fourth and perhaps the most surprising factor to me was when the leaders talked about the role of maximising conflict. It confused me a little until I realised that what they were talking about was something that academics call integrative conflict. That means making use of disagreements within the team to identify the key issues and resolve them without it descending into negative conflict and argument. I especially like Deborah Dunsire's comment at this point, where she said that disagreement, if you handle it well, if you manage it well, gets everyone to raise their game, which is an interesting point. And then the final point of the decisive facilitation process is to precipitate the decision. This involves judging the moment when discussion has been sufficient, but before the discussion goes on too long. So you're finding the window, as it were. And then in that window, asking the right questions to get the leadership team to come together around a clear, consensual decision. It's quite an art to do this. I vividly remember Patrice Baudry of Leo describing how this was done. And he described it like a skill or a craft of a great artist. It was really interesting to hear how it was done. There are, of course, several ways important ways that life science leaders behave that are adaptations to their environment, and I've just had time to mention two of them. Just like biological adaptation, I think these behaviours add up to and reinforce each other, but you'll need to read the book to find the others, I think. Because I want to use the limited time we have to cover the last little bit of my research agenda. Obviously, very few of us will get to the C-suite. But I think and I hope that my research has lessons for those people who are not CEOs. So I asked the CEOs, what should those who are being led learn from the leaders? What do the leaders need of them and know of them? And four lessons emerged. The first is that they want you to be an expert. And what I mean by that is that they want you to be an expert in your particular field, whether that is marketing or strategy or R&D or law or whatever it is. They need you to be an expert because they recognise, the CEOs recognise, that they can't manage the complexity of all these different environments we operate in. So they depend upon you to do it in order to achieve this bicongruence that I talked about. The second thing they talked about was T-shaped skills. If you're not familiar with that term, that means that in addition to deep and narrow I-shaped skills about your speciality, they need to have a broad, shallow knowledge of the functions. They value that because that enables bicongruence. The third thing they talked about was commitment to the company. And interestingly, they contrasted this with commitment to your department or your organisation. One CEO talking about her chief marketing officer that she wasn't very happy with said, I don't want my chief marketing officer to be the member of parliament representing marketing. That's not the way it works. Because as social beings, we all have a tendency to work towards loyalty to our subgroup. But this is anathema to CEOs. What they want is subordinates who understand and support the organisational goals, even if it's at the cost of putting your own team in second place. And then the final thing that they mentioned of the four things was being trustworthy. You see, a life sciences organisation is a complex organisation. It's like a machine, and it's oiled by trusting relationships. That's how it works. And trust takes time and effort to learn. You earn it by honest behaviour, by delivering on your promises, and by avoiding political behaviour. And it would seem to me that trustworthiness is the attribute that CEOs value most in their colleagues. Of course, in most big organisations, someone has responsibility for developing the future leaders. And I think that my findings have important lessons for them. So if you work with those sorts of guys, by all means, send this presentation to them. First thing that I think we need to learn in terms of leadership development is that it needs to be tailored to the industry. I think a lot of the generalised leadership development that I might call sheep dip development, where you just dunk everybody in the same process, is not appropriate to the unusual, exceptional conditions of industry. Second, I think leadership development needs to include these specialised adaptations that I talk about in the book, like use of the mission statement, like decisive facilitation. Third, I think we need to stay away from fads that aren't based on honesty, like trying to be Steve Jobs. And then finally, I think leadership development needs to work not only for those who will become leaders, but for those who will not. So I think we should teach those lessons about expertise and commitment and skills and trust to everybody. So with that, let me return to that man at Norte Airport. What I should have said to him was that actually leadership isn't leadership, because it's not the same in all situations. Great leadership is an adaptation to the conditions, and the exceptional conditions of the life science industry that I've described require a particularly exquisite, intelligent, delicate form of adaptation. So I hope this webinar and perhaps the book will help you understand those adaptations, whether you want to be lead or to be one of the led. Thank you very much for listening. I'm glad.